Hello, my name is Emily, and I'm about to share a story that completely changed my perspective on patience, success, and the strange ways life comes full circle. 20 years ago, I was a shy, awkward teenager whose world was shattered by a teacher's cruel words in front of my entire class. Today, I'm a successful real estate investor, and that same teacher, well, she's about to become my tenant. But this isn't just about revenge. It's about something much more complex than that. Picture this. You're 15 years old, sitting in your high school English class, and your teacher decides to use you as an example of everything that's wrong with public education. The humiliation cuts so deep that it shapes the next 2 decades of your life. That's exactly what happened to me at Lincoln High School in Portland, Oregon, and I bet many of you have similar stories tucked away in the corners of your memory. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing, but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. Now, you might be thinking this is going to be one of those sweet revenge stories where the underdog gets back at the mean teacher and everyone lives happily ever after. But real life is messier than that, isn't it? What I discovered when I finally came face to face with Mrs. Henderson again wasn't what I expected at all. Sometimes the people who hurt us are fighting battles we never knew existed, and sometimes getting everything you thought you wanted leaves you questioning what you actually need. This story spans 2 decades, 3 different cities, and one very complicated relationship between a teacher and her former student. It's about ambition, born from humiliation, success that tastes bittersweet, and the moment when you realize that some victories feel hollow. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let me tell you about the day that changed everything, both 20 years ago and just last month. It was a Tuesday morning in November 2005, and I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. The fluorescent lights in Mrs. Henderson's classroom cast that harsh, institutional glow over everything, making even the motivational posters on the walls look depressing. I was sitting in the 3rd row, middle seat, my usual spot where I thought I could blend into the background. How wrong I was. Mrs. Henderson was in her early 40s then, with perfectly styled auburn hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than my mom's monthly grocery budget. She had this way of carrying herself that screamed authority, and most students either feared or respected her. I fell into the fear category, which made what happened next even more devastating. We were discussing our college application essays, and she was walking around the room, occasionally stopping to read over someone's shoulder. When she reached my desk, I felt my stomach drop. I'd been working on an essay about wanting to become a real estate developer, inspired by watching my single mother struggle to find decent, affordable housing after my father left us. "Miss Parker," she said, her voice cutting through the classroom chatter like a knife. Everyone stopped talking. "Would you mind sharing your essay topic with the class?" My mouth went dry. It's about real estate development, ma'am." The silence that followed was deafening. Then she laughed. Not a kind laugh, but the type that made you feel small. "Real estate development? Emily, sweetheart, let's be realistic here. You can barely manage a C+ in my class, and you think you're going to navigate the complexities of commercial real estate?" Heat crept up my neck as 30 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I wanted to disappear, to melt into my plastic chair and never exist again. "I mean, I understand having dreams," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension, "but someone from your background might want to consider more attainable goals, perhaps community college and a nice secretarial program. There's no shame in knowing your place." The worst part wasn't just her words. It was the way some of my classmates snickered. Madison Cooper, the popular girl who always had perfect highlights, actually giggled behind her hand. Even Jake Morrison, who I'd had a crush on since sophomore year, was smirking. "Mrs. Henderson," I managed to whisper, "I've been researching programs at Portland State and—" "Oh, honey," she interrupted, "researching and actually succeeding are 2 very different things. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I can usually tell which students have what it takes. You're a sweet girl, Emily, but you lack the confidence, the presence, how should I put this delicately? The socioeconomic foundation that real success requires. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of everyone. Instead, I nodded and looked down at my essay. All those hours of work, all those dreams I'd poured onto the page suddenly feeling worthless. The bell rang, and everyone scrambled to pack up their things. As students filed out, chattering about their weekend plans, I sat frozen in my seat. Mrs. Henderson approached my desk one more time. "Emily, I hope you understand that I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to save you from disappointment. Set realistic expectations, and you'll live a much happier life." That night, I went home to our tiny apartment above the laundromat where my mom worked double shifts just to keep us afloat. I told her about my day, expecting sympathy. Instead, she surprised me. "Baby girl," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Some people will try to put you in a box their whole lives. The question is, are you going to let them?" My mother's words became my battle cry. That humiliating Tuesday didn't break me. It forged me. Over the next few weeks, something fundamental shifted inside me. Where there had once been a quiet, insecure teenager, there was now someone with a burning determination that surprised even me. I threw myself into research with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every evening after school, I'd walk to the Portland Public Library and spend hours reading everything I could find about real estate development, property management, and commercial investments. I memorized market trends, studied successful developers, and learned about zoning laws until my eyes burned. Mrs. Henderson seemed to take my newfound focus as a personal challenge. During the remaining months of junior year, she found countless ways to remind me of my place. When I raised my hand to answer questions, she'd smile that patronizing smile and say things like, "Let's hear from someone else. Emily's still learning to think critically." When I turned in assignments early, she'd make comments about how eager students sometimes miss the finer details. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It's like being invisible, and invisible people see everything. I watched Mrs. Henderson carefully, noting how she treated different students based on their family backgrounds. The kids from West Side families, the ones whose parents were doctors and lawyers, got encouragement and extra opportunities. Students like me, from the working-class East Side, got subtle discouragement wrapped in fake concern. By senior year, I had developed a thick skin and a strategic mind. I maintained decent grades while secretly building my real estate knowledge. I started attending open houses on weekends, pretending to be interested in buying, which was laughable given that my mom and I were barely scraping by. Real estate agents, thinking I was just another young person window shopping, would sometimes let me tag along to multiple properties. That's where I met Robert Chen, an investor who took pity on this enthusiastic teenager, asking detailed questions about cap rates and cash flow analysis. He became my unofficial mentor, meeting with me once a month at a coffee shop downtown to discuss market strategies and investment principles. "Emily," he told me during one of our meetings, "most people your age are thinking about prom and spring break. You're analyzing rental yields and neighborhood demographics. That tells me you're serious." Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson continued her campaign of subtle sabotage. During college application season, she wrote what I later learned was a lukewarm recommendation letter. When I asked her about it, she said, "I wrote honestly about your capabilities, dear. Colleges appreciate authentic assessments." I didn't let it derail me. I applied to Portland State's business program, worked part-time at a local restaurant, and saved every penny I could. My essay, the same one Mrs. Henderson had mocked months earlier, got me accepted with a partial scholarship. The day I graduated from Lincoln High, Mrs. Henderson approached me at the reception afterward. "Emily, I hope you'll remember our conversations as you move forward. College is expensive, and not everyone is cut out for business. There's still time to consider more practical options." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't feel small. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but I'm going to prove you wrong." She laughed that same condescending laugh. "Oh, honey, I admire your spirit, but spirit doesn't pay the bills." That summer, while working double shifts at the restaurant to save money for college, I made myself a promise. I would become everything she said I couldn't be. I would build the success she claimed was beyond my reach. And someday, somehow, I would make sure she knew exactly who Emily Parker had become. What I couldn't have predicted was how that promise would consume the next 20 years of my life, driving me to achieve things I never thought possible. And eventually, leading me to a moment of truth that would change both our lives forever. College was about to begin, and with it, the real journey toward proving that a girl from the wrong side of the tracks could build an empire. College wasn't easy, but I attacked it with the same fierce determination that had been burning in me since that day in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. Portland State's business program was competitive, filled with students whose parents had paved their paths with connections and family money. I was working 25 hours a week at the restaurant while maintaining a full course load, but I refused to let that be an excuse. My real education happened outside the classroom. Robert Chen introduced me to his network of investors, and I became known as the kid who asks the smart questions. I spent weekends attending real estate seminars, often being the youngest person in the room by decades. Other attendees would sometimes pat me on the head condescendingly, but I absorbed every lesson like a sponge. During my sophomore year, something incredible happened. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who owned a small duplex near campus, was struggling to manage her property. Her tenant in the lower unit had moved out, leaving damage that she couldn't afford to repair. Robert mentioned her situation during one of our coffee meetings, thinking it might be a good learning experience for me to see a property evaluation up close. When I met Mrs. Patterson, I saw an opportunity that others had missed. The duplex was in a neighborhood showing early signs of gentrification. Coffee shops were opening, young professionals were moving in, and property values were starting to rise. The bones of the building were solid. It just needed someone with vision and sweat equity. "Mrs. Patterson," I said after walking through the property, "what if I handled the renovations and management in exchange for a partnership deal?" She looked at me skeptically. "Honey, you're just a college student. Do you have any idea what property management involves?" I pulled out a folder I'd prepared: market analysis, renovation estimates, projected rental income, and a detailed business plan. "I've been studying this building and neighborhood for weeks. I know exactly what it involves." That conversation led to my first real estate deal at 19 years old. Mrs. Patterson agreed to let me manage the renovations and find tenants in exchange for a 25% ownership stake. I spent every free moment that summer learning plumbing, painting, and basic carpentry from YouTube videos and helpful hardware store employees. The duplex was fully rented within 3 months, generating enough cash flow to cover expenses and provide both Mrs. Patterson and me with monthly income. More importantly, it proved I could turn theory into practice. Word spread through Robert's network about the college kid who had successfully renovated and leased a problem property. By my junior year, I was managing 3 small properties and had saved enough money to put a down payment on my own investment: a small house near the university that I rented to graduate students. My professors started using my projects as case studies in their classes. Dr. Williams, who taught real estate finance, would often invite me to share my experiences with other students. It felt surreal, going from being told I wasn't college material to being held up as an example of practical application. But success came with sacrifices. While my classmates were joining sororities, going to parties, and dating, I was reviewing lease agreements and coordinating maintenance requests. I told myself it was worth it, that every Friday night spent analyzing market data was an investment in proving Mrs. Henderson wrong. During my senior year, I reached a milestone that felt particularly sweet. I had accumulated enough capital to purchase a small apartment building. It was nothing fancy, just a 6-unit complex in an up-and-coming neighborhood, but it represented something powerful. I was 21 years old and owned real estate worth more than most people's annual salaries. The day I signed the papers, I thought about calling Lincoln High School and asking them to pass along a message to Mrs. Henderson. I wanted her to know that the girl she'd tried to crush was now a property owner and successful investor. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the realization that my success should speak for itself. After graduation, I faced a choice that would define the next phase of my life. I could stay in Portland, continue building my modest portfolio, and live comfortably. Or I could take a massive risk and chase something bigger. The fire that Mrs. Henderson had ignited was still burning, and comfortable wasn't enough. I sold my Portland properties, packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic, and drove south to Los Angeles. If I was going to prove that I could succeed in real estate development, I needed to do it in one of the most competitive markets in the country. Los Angeles in 2009 was a city of contradictions. The financial crisis had left countless properties in foreclosure, creating opportunities for investors with cash and courage. I had saved $180,000 from my Portland deals. Not much by LA standards, but enough to get started if I was smart and aggressive. I rented a tiny studio apartment in Koreatown and spent my first months learning the market. LA real estate was like playing chess on expert level after learning the game in Portland. The stakes were higher, the competition fiercer, and the potential rewards astronomical. My breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a distressed property auction in downtown LA. Most investors were avoiding downtown then. It was still rough, filled with homeless encampments and abandoned buildings. But I saw what others missed: early signs of urban renewal, new businesses moving in, and young professionals willing to live in grittier neighborhoods for affordability. I purchased a 4-story building for $320,000, using my savings, plus a hard money loan that came with crushing interest rates. The building was a mess: broken windows, graffiti, and structural issues that would have scared off most investors. But it was also solid brick and steel, with beautiful bones waiting to be uncovered. The renovation took 8 months and nearly broke me, both financially and physically. I was working 16-hour days, coordinating contractors, handling permits, and doing much of the manual labor myself to save money. There were nights I'd fall asleep on the building's floor, too exhausted to drive home. My mother called regularly, worried about my health and sanity. "Baby girl," she'd say, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. You've already succeeded." But she was wrong. I did have something to prove, and I wouldn't stop until I'd proven it completely. The finished building was spectacular: exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, hardwood floors, and modern amenities that appealed to young professionals. I converted it into 12 loft-style apartments and rented them within 6 weeks of completion. The project generated enough profit to pay off the construction loan and fund my next deal. Over the next 5 years, I refined my strategy. Identify undervalued properties in neighborhoods showing early gentrification signs, renovate them to attract upscale tenants, and hold them for long-term appreciation. It was working. My portfolio grew to include 15 properties across LA, from downtown lofts to beachside condos in Santa Monica. By 2015, I was managing over $8 million in real estate assets and had been featured in several industry publications as a young entrepreneur to watch. I hired a small team, an assistant, a maintenance coordinator, and a part-time accountant, and finally felt like a real business owner rather than just someone juggling too many responsibilities. But success brought new challenges. The bigger I grew, the more complex the problems became. Difficult tenants, major repairs, market fluctuations, and regulatory changes required constant attention and strategic thinking. I was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible, but I was also working more hours than seemed humanly sustainable. During quiet moments, I'd sometimes think about Mrs. Henderson. I wondered if she was still teaching, still telling students from working-class families to lower their expectations. The thought would reignite that familiar fire, pushing me to take on even bigger projects and more ambitious goals. In 2020, everything changed. For me, and for the entire world. The pandemic hit Los Angeles real estate like a tsunami, creating both opportunities and threats that I'd never encountered. While some investors panicked and sold at losses, I saw a chance to expand in ways that had previously been impossible. But the isolation of lockdown made me realize something I'd been avoiding for years. I was lonely. I'd spent 15 years building an empire, proving my worth to someone who probably didn't even remember my name, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten to build a life. That's when I got the call that would bring everything full circle. My mother, now in her early 60s, had been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. She was going to be fine. The doctors caught it early, but she needed support during treatment. Portland was calling me home. I made a decision that surprised even me. I would relocate my business back to Oregon. LA had been good to me, but I could manage my properties remotely and use the opportunity to expand into Portland's rapidly growing market. The city had changed dramatically since I'd left. Tech companies were moving in, property values were soaring, and the Portland I remembered was transforming into something almost unrecognizable. Finding suitable office space led me to a beautiful, historic building in the Pearl District, exactly the kind of neighborhood transformation I specialized in recognizing and investing in. As I was touring potential spaces, my real estate agent mentioned that the building was owned by a local teacher who was looking to sell. "She's been here for decades," he explained, "but she's getting older and wants to liquidate her real estate holdings. Sweet lady, actually teaches at Lincoln High School." My blood went cold. Lincoln High School? "Yeah, you know it? She's been there forever. Mrs. Henderson, I think her name is." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. After all these years, after building everything I'd built, fate was handing me the opportunity I'd never dared to imagine. Mrs. Henderson owned the building I wanted to buy. I maintained my composure during the rest of the tour, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was the convergence of 20 years of ambition, resentment, and determination. That evening, I researched everything I could find about Mrs. Henderson's current situation. She was now 63, still teaching at Lincoln High, and according to public records, owned several properties around Portland that she'd inherited from her parents. She was asset-rich but appeared to be cash-poor, likely explaining why she was looking to sell. I had my attorney make an all-cash offer that was fair but not generous, exactly what a savvy investor would offer. I didn't want her to think she was getting any special treatment, but I also didn't want to be vindictive. This was business, not personal revenge. Or so I told myself. 3 weeks later, I owned the building where Mrs. Henderson had been paying rent for her small office space. She was now technically my tenant, though she didn't know it yet. I'd purchased the property through one of my LLC entities, so my name wasn't directly visible on the paperwork. The irony was delicious and terrifying at the same time. The woman who had told me I'd never amount to anything was now paying rent to the empire I'd built. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt empty. This wasn't how I'd imagined it would feel. 2 months after the purchase, Mrs. Henderson's lease came up for renewal. This was my moment. The confrontation I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I was 15 years old. I could raise her rent to market rates, which would likely force her out. I could reveal my identity and watch her realize who her new landlord was. I could have the satisfaction of seeing her recognize that she'd been completely wrong about me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by an unexpected emotion: uncertainty. What did I actually want from this situation? I scheduled the lease renewal meeting for a Thursday afternoon, telling my property manager that I would handle this tenant personally. For the first time in years, I felt nervous about a business meeting. I'd negotiated million-dollar deals with seasoned developers, but the thought of sitting across from Mrs. Henderson made my palms sweat. She arrived at my office exactly on time, something I remembered about her from high school. She was older now, of course, with gray streaking her auburn hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of 2 decades of teaching teenagers. But she still carried herself with that same authoritative posture, though I noticed she seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than the woman who had loomed so large in my memories. "Miss Parker?" she said, looking confused as she entered my office. "I was expecting to meet with the property manager about my lease renewal." This was it, the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since that humiliating day in her classroom. I could have drawn it out, made her realize slowly who I was, but something about seeing her in person made all my planned dramatics seem petty. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. Please have a seat. I'm Emily Parker. I own this building now. I believe you remember me from Lincoln High School." The color drained from her face as recognition dawned. She sat down heavily, her purse clutching tightly in her lap. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. "Emily," she finally whispered. "My God, Emily Parker, I remember you." "I'm sure you do," I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You told me I'd never amount to anything in real estate, that I should know my place." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were filled with something I didn't expect. Shame. "Yes," she said quietly. "I remember that day very clearly. It's one of my greatest regrets." That stopped me cold. In all my fantasies about this moment, I'd never imagined her expressing regret. "I was going through a difficult time in my life then," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My marriage was falling apart, my father was dying, and I was drowning in debt from his medical bills. None of that excuses what I did to you, but maybe it explains it. I took my frustration out on a student who reminded me of my own impossible dreams." I felt the carefully constructed walls of resentment beginning to crack. This wasn't the vindictive teacher of my memories. This was a broken woman who had made a terrible mistake. "You reminded me of myself at your age," she said, looking directly at me now. "I wanted to be a writer, you know. I was going to move to New York and write the great American novel. But life happened. Student loans, family obligations, fear. I settled for teaching, telling myself it was noble, but part of me always felt like a failure." "So you decided to make me feel like one too?" "Yes," she said simply. "And I've regretted it every day since. Not just what I said to you, but what I said to dozens of other students over the years. I was supposed to be building you up, and instead I was tearing you down because I was bitter about my own choices." The conversation I'd imagined for 20 years was nothing like this. Where was my triumphant moment? Where was the satisfaction of proving her wrong? "Emily," she said, leaning forward slightly, "I need you to know that I followed your career. When you started getting mentioned in business journals, when you were featured in that real estate weekly article, I kept clippings. I was proud of you, and ashamed of myself." "You kept clippings of my success?" "I did, and I used them in my classes. I would tell my students about Emily Parker, the girl who proved that dreams and determination matter more than background or circumstances. I never mentioned that I was the teacher who tried to crush those dreams." The silence stretched between us as I processed her words. This wasn't the vindictive villain I'd carried in my memory for 2 decades. This was a flawed human being who'd made mistakes and lived with the consequences. "Mrs. Henderson," I said finally, "I need to be honest with you. I didn't buy this building by accident. I knew you were a tenant here when I made the offer." She nodded slowly. "I figured as much. So what happens now? Are you going to evict me? Raise my rent until I can't afford it? I wouldn't blame you if you did." The question hung in the air. What did happen now? I'd spent 20 years climbing toward this moment, and now that I was here, I realized I'd never actually decided what I wanted from it. "Tell me about your students now," I said, instead of answering her question. She looked surprised, but began talking about her current classes. As she spoke, her entire demeanor changed. Her eyes lit up when she described helping a shy student find confidence, or when she talked about a former student who'd just been accepted to college. Despite everything, it was clear that teaching wasn't just her job. It was her calling. "There's a girl in my AP English class this year," she said. "Reminds me so much of you at that age. Brilliant, ambitious, but from a difficult background. Her mother works 2 jobs. They're barely scraping by. And Jasmine, that's her name, wants to study environmental law." Some days I see doubt creeping into her eyes, and I remember how I contributed to that doubt in you. What do you tell her? I tell her that the only limits that matter are the ones she accepts. I tell her about students like you who refuse to let anyone define their potential. I try to be the teacher I should have been 20 years ago. I found myself genuinely moved by her transformation. The bitter, insecure woman who had hurt me had evolved into someone who was trying to make amends through her current students. Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something? Why are you still teaching? With your property investments, you could have retired years ago. She laughed, but it was different from that cruel laugh I remembered. This one was rueful, self-aware. Because despite everything, I'm good at it now. It took me years to realize that my job wasn't to protect students from disappointment. It was to prepare them for success. And because I owe a debt to every student I discouraged over the years. Including me. Especially you. We sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. I was reassessing everything I thought I knew about this woman, about my motivations, about what I actually wanted from this situation. Your rent, I said finally. I'm not going to raise it. Actually, I'm going to lower it to what you were paying 5 years ago. Use the extra money to help students like Jasmine. Maybe set up a scholarship fund or something. Her eyes filled with tears. Emily, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. But maybe this is how we move forward. You help students achieve their dreams, and I help make it financially possible for you to keep doing that. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Thank you, but I need you to know, I don't expect forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. Maybe, I said, but holding on to anger for 20 years has been exhausting. I built an empire partly out of spite, and while I'm grateful for what I've achieved, I think it's time to build something out of purpose instead. As she gathered her things to leave, Mrs. Henderson paused at the door. Emily, for what it's worth, I'm incredibly proud of who you've become. Not just successful, but strong, compassionate, and generous. You became everything I should have encouraged you to be. After Mrs. Henderson left that day, I sat in my office for hours, staring out at the Portland skyline and thinking about the strange turns life takes. I'd spent 20 years preparing for a confrontation that ended up being a conversation. I'd built success on the foundation of proving someone wrong, only to discover that she'd already realized her mistake and had been trying to make amends in her own way. The Emily Parker Scholarship Fund launched 6 months later, with Mrs. Henderson helping to identify students who needed both financial support and encouragement to pursue ambitious dreams. The first recipient was Jasmine, that student from her AP English class who wanted to study environmental law. Watching her receive the award, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes, I finally understood what real success felt like. I still own that building, and Mrs. Henderson still teaches from her small office on the second floor. Sometimes we run into each other in the hallway, and we'll chat briefly about her students or my latest projects. It's not friendship exactly, too much history for that, but it's something better than the resentment I carried for so long. The funny thing about revenge is that when you finally get the chance to take it, you often realize it's not what you actually wanted. What I wanted was acknowledgement that I had value, that my dreams were valid, that I was capable of more than anyone had given me credit for. I got all of that, but not in the way I expected. My business continues to grow, but now it's driven by purpose rather than spite. I specialize in creating affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods, trying to build communities rather than just profits. It's more challenging and sometimes less lucrative than pure profit-driven development, but it feels like using my success for something meaningful. Last month, I received an invitation to speak at Lincoln High School's Career Day. Mrs. Henderson had recommended me, she said in her email, because her students needed to hear from someone who understood that success isn't determined by your starting point, but by your willingness to keep moving forward despite obstacles. Standing in front of those teenagers, looking out at faces that reminded me of my 15-year-old self, I realized that Mrs. Henderson had given me something valuable after all. Not the encouragement I needed at the time, but the fire that forged me into someone strong enough to encourage others. So, here's what I learned from 20 years of building an empire on the ashes of humiliation. Sometimes the people who hurt us are fighting battles we can't see. Sometimes the revenge we think we want isn't what we actually need. And sometimes the most powerful victory is choosing compassion over conquest. If you're watching this and you've got your own Mrs. Henderson, someone who made you feel small, who told you that you weren't good enough, let me tell you something. Prove them wrong, absolutely. Build the success they said you couldn't achieve. But when you get there, and you will get there, remember that the real victory isn't in their acknowledgement of your worth. It's in your knowledge of your own value and in your ability to lift others up the way you wished someone had lifted you. Thanks for taking this journey with me. If my story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that their dreams are valid, no matter what anyone else says. And remember, success isn't just about proving doubters wrong, it's about proving yourself right.